My name is Valery Minenko, and I'm a founder of the game development studio Twee Games. And today I will be a moderator here, so I will moderate this track for you. And our first speaker is Jupiter Hadley. She is a game journalist, and today she prepared a talk for you about how to make a good first impression with your game. Please welcome her.
Hello, my name's Jupiter, and as I was kindly introduced, I'm going to be talking about making a good first impression with your game and making the first moment that people see your game matter and more stick with people in a better way. So first, I'm going to give a little background of who I am. I'm currently a community manager for a Roblox gaming company called Toya Play. I used to YouTube 5,000-ish games a year on YouTube, primarily from game jams. So I saw a lot of first minutes of games through that. And I do a lot of games journalism for Indie Games Plus, Games Radar, Big Boss Battle, Pocket Gamer, places like that. And I've also created this calendar of all of the game jams happening in the world. So game jams are sort of where I came into the industry, and it's something that I've really enjoyed and been a part of. So the reason that I like giving this talk, and there's lots of pictures of my cats in here just to be distracting, I guess. So that's one of my cats, Pesto. The reason that I give this talk is because there are thousands of games that are being released each and every day. And when you release a game, it's so easy to not ever get plays, especially as an indie. It's so easy to get lost in all of the different games that are being released. And it's really discouraging to a lot of indies to just not be ever seen or played, especially when you've made something and you put your heart into it. And if you do get played, you'll find that players, gamers, don't actually play your game for very long. They make a decision on if they're going to continue your game within the first 10 seconds of playing, really. And that's something that indies need to be aware of and need to utilize the first few seconds of gameplay in the first minute and ensure that there is an impact that players then can relate to so that their game does continue to be played. So before we even get into talking about your game, the game itself, we also need to talk about your game's page. When an indie releases their first game, they're often not releasing it on Steam. Steam's a bit different where it forces you to add all of the required assets in key art, whereas when you release something on Itch or GameJolt or any of the free platforms, they don't require everything you could possibly need. So understanding what you need to put on your page to make it stand out will already put you ahead of people who are just uploading basic stuff. And new games that are also nice looking, that are presented well, even if your game doesn't play in browser, tend to be featured on these platforms. And when your game is featured, that instantly drives a lot of traffic to it if it's featured on Twitter, if it's featured on the game's homepage, or if it's featured under the category that your game's in. And all of that can really help your game get plays and get players in. When you make a page, you need to think about the screenshots that you're using. You need to use videos or GIFs that make your game able to see in motion. You need to think about the thumbnail that's going to be the little icon that people click on when they're looking at a category. You need to think about if you want a background for that page, which may seem like a simple thing, but can really make it stand out. And you need to put time into the information that you have displayed on that game page as well. So here's a game from GameJolt, and it was a very basic game. It was up for an hour. There's literally nothing here to show me what the game is. It is a play-in webpage game, so I could just play it now. But there's nothing there to make me want to play it. Even though I wouldn't have to download it, there's not that barrier to download. You still need to make your page look good. They did write a description, which was just reach as high as you can by clicking repeatedly, catch leaves to gain height bonuses, which is good that it has instructions, but there's still nothing to make a player want to click play. And because of that, no one's viewed the page, no one's clicked on it in a site that did feature all of the newest games in a new category. So it was on a homepage for a few moments. Then we've got another game which had only been out for 37 minutes on GameJolt and already had 17 people sort of following the developer, but 11 plays already. And this was a download game. And what it had is some pictures and a thumbnail and just the very basic stuff, which does actually matter. In the description, it has the controls on how to play, which is very important because if people can't play your game, if they physically don't know how to play your game, they're not going to look more for it. They're going to exit. So if you don't have a tutorial, having controls there is very, very important. There's a little bit of a story behind the game itself. There's just more there for people to relate with and to check out. And this was a game that ended up being featured. It was actually originally a Game Jam game. And they took the time to make this giant banner across the top. It was really eye-catching. They added loads of pictures, a trailer, videos. It has over 111,000 plays on it. They added the game's soundtrack for download. It's just so much of a different experience than the first game where you didn't know anything about it, because you can clearly see the art style. You can see more about the game. You can listen to some of the sounds in the game before you dive in and play if you want. The description includes quotes from websites that have written about the game since its release. And that's always something that if you do have a website that's written about your game, you should consider including some of those quotes in, because humans as a whole, they like to like things that people like, if that makes sense. So if other people like your thing, they'll assume they'll like your thing. It's in the same way that people like to hate things that everyone hates. So if people are hating something, other people will hate that too, just by proxy. It's just kind of the way that humans work. And it works the same with people liking it. So if I know indiespeedrun.com and I think they're great, and they think that the game's great, instantly I think that the game's great because I trust that site and I see that quote. So definitely something to keep in mind, especially as your games grow. And if you enter it in a contest or win any sort of awards, having little badges on your game too that they give you for those, that really, really helps. This is the same thing, but sort of on itch. This is one of the games that were there just on the itch homepage for a little bit and the newly released, and it has a bit of a description. It's got an image, but that's it. Itch pages work a little bit differently than Game Jolt. Like by default, they're really plain. So you do need to spend more time working on them because doing bare basics, since it's not divided up on that website, it's just not as appealing to players. Then we had this, which was, again, another Game Jam game where they spent time really putting in loads of stuff. There's a bunch of pictures and images. There's links to where the original game was. They have all of their files so that you can play older builds, but they also have an update log. And that's interesting. Game Jolt has a way that you can add updates into like a separate page so that people who are really interested in your game can see it. But having an update log in a game that you are constantly updating lets players know that this is a game that's under current work. So they expect you to be updating it. They expect things to change, and they understand if they find bugs, the game is in a active development process. And that's something to keep in mind if you are releasing games that are early or are in beta or are still coming out through updates. And then this was another game that was uploaded to itch, and it is a game that they've gone above and beyond with the entire page. They've got a beautiful background that matches their game. They've got loads of screenshots, loads of art. They've put screenshots in their page, which looks really wonderful. They've taken the time to add in like links to the developers, links to the sound. They have a donation button where people can donate or they can pay what you want for the game. They've got a Bandicam track as well, so that you can download the music if you want, as well as the game downloads. And they had used the community button in itch. So if you're trying to develop like a community through itch, you can make like forums about your specific game, and then you can share stuff there. So if your game has like Easter eggs, or if you have a game that drives a community to make tutorials on how to build bases, for example, or the best strategies to work through your game, or how to solve puzzles, using itch to create a community area where you can then interact with people who are getting stuck on puzzles or encourage people who've done a cool thing in your game is a good way to continue to interact with your community. And that's all done through their page. So it's not something that you have to go and do for yourself, which is an easier way to just sort of manage a community once you build up to that. So once you've looked at your game's page as a player, you then would download the game or hit play, and you'd move on to your game's face. So this is the starting screen of your game. It's what everyone's going to look at instantly. Your game should always have a starting screen, no matter what. There should just be a starting screen, and there's lots of reasons for that. Even if you have a heavily story-based game and you want to start with a cutscene, make sure there is a screen where the player can, as a human, reset and get ready to play the game. They can put their hands on the controls, they can stare at the screen, and they can start it on their own pace, because that brings about a better experience. When you make your game's face, you want to make sure that everything is easy to locate. You want to make sure, obviously, the play button is easy to locate, but also if you have an information button, that's easy to locate. If you have a credits button, if you have stuff that people need to interact with, it's clearly shown there, it's marked, and can be found. If you don't have a tutorial in your game, having on your game screen how to play really helps, because again, if people can't play your game, they're not going to be able to play your game. So they'll need some sort of guide there, even if you're really good at that game yourself. There are a lot of cool ways to include interactive start screens. They're one of my favorite things to see in games because they're such a unique aspect. Not a lot of developers have completely mastered or implemented interactive start screens, but having them makes your game stand out a bit more and are really, really unique. And it's something that makes games stick with people, because basically the start screen is a part of the game. So it's a way to really well incorporate that. And I'm going to show you some now. So this is a game called Dick Dick. It's just a little two-player local multiplayer game. And for the start screen to start the game, it's actually a tutorial. So player one is hitting A, and that's bringing up that little pillar. And then the second player can move around this little Dick Dick, it's named the animal, and they need to get up there and then hold both up to start. And so once they've pushed both up to the very top, you've basically had a little demo on how to control the whole game. And so when you go into the game, you know exactly what you're doing. It's very easy to quickly get into it and start playing, which basically means that you don't need a tutorial. Everything's learned right then and there. So this is another game that was made really quickly for a game jam, and it shows the tutorial in the start menu. So all of the words are down there in the start menu, but you also need to basically complete the first action in order to start the game. So this is me sort of discovering hitboxes and what way to pull back before I get into the actual gameplay, and learning how to do that before you then take on a level, especially if you have something tricky like hitboxes that are very specifically in the center of your big object. Having that sort of precursor level makes a whole lot of sense, and it foregoes the need for a big tutorial. But you've also got more simple, I guess, tutorial-like start screens. This is Vital Dungeon Rescue, and each time you play the game, you get a different start screen, and it's a start screen. Well, that moved forward. It's a start screen that you cannot die in. It won't kill your player. You don't lose a lot of hearts or anything, but you can often get a couple of extra things at the start, or you can try out a little level. And as it's procedurally generated, each time a player plays, they're able to take it on differently. And so it's almost like having a little taster into what the game will be, though the game itself is quite a bit more hard than this. And then you can also do start screens that are just like animated. So these are particularly good for showcasing your game at events. This is a game called Mau Mau Castle. It showed at like 60 events around the world. And whenever the game, losing my voice today. Whenever the game starts, it's on this, oh my goodness. There we go. It's on this little loop where after a few seconds, the name comes in, the whole thing shakes, and the cat's eyes blink. And this is really eye-catching, especially when looking around an expo floor, and especially when looking for games to check out. And one of the things about this game is the main character is that big cat with those big eyes. Humans, when they see animals especially, but things with big eyes, like Disney eyes are kind of what it's called, it's something that does draw people in, especially younger people, especially children. They'll love to play this because they'll see the big eyes and the big fluffy cat, and it's instantly something they're drawn to, just statistically. Figment is another example of just a good start screen that's slightly animated. The game itself is about having dreams that are sort of nightmares, and you work your way through puzzles trying to figure out what's happened. You can clearly see everything that's labeled there. You can clearly see that it has everything that you'd possibly need. It's got settings, which the game has a tutorial in-game, so you don't need to read a how-to here. It's got the credits so that you can find the developer. It has a way to exit the game because it's a full screen game. And you can kind of get the vibe of the game from this title screen, from these sad clouds raining all over you. And then Flawist is a good example on mobile. When you start this game up on mobile, it gives you this little cutscene of your character diving through and destroying the main owl and collecting a bunch of money, I guess, which this isn't in the same style as the game at all. It's literally built just to draw people into the game on mobile. So when you dive into the game, the graphics are different. And the whole idea behind this was to create something that was a bit more interesting that would then captivate the people that were looking to play it, which can be, when used correctly, a good idea. Now, if you have like a completely different like vibe from the beginning of your game to what your game is, it's not going to work out very well for you because players will feel misled. But as a game that does have to do with this bird fighting through stuff, it does make sense to have sort of this cooler, almost TV-esque intro to it. And then these are just some good basic start screens. Stardew Valley does have a little animation on the clouds, but it's very good that it shows everything quite simply and you can see it all. And then there's this little question box which gives you more information. And there's also a mute button, which is something that if you can put a mute button in, you should put a mute button in your game. A lot of people will want to not hear your game sound. I'm sorry. So having that option for those users are good. And then this little square up here is a little full screen button. So you can actually just tick it to make it a windowed experience, which again, some people prefer a windowed experience. Some people only have one computer and they want to put on your game and maybe a TV show in the background. And so having that option to easily go to a windowed experience that they can then change the size of is just a good way to have a better player experience. Valhalla, on the other hand, has a massive cutscene at the start. And then it ends with this screen where you can easily see the different options that you need and then start the game. And it's a good reset point so that players are then ready to go into the game. When it comes beyond your game space into your game, we're going to talk about different aspects inside the game. So one of the first things that people notice are graphics. That's their visuals. Your graphics don't have to be super beautiful. They don't have to be super complex. They don't have to be a huge work of brilliant watercolor art that everyone looks at and thinks belongs in a museum. But they do need to be clean graphics that look well. They do need to have consistency throughout the entire game. They do need to be scaled correctly. And you should think about fonts. Fonts are a good way to get more of the feel of your game into it. And you want to make sure the fonts are legible along with different groups of people. Some people struggle more with fonts than others, and that's something to keep in mind. So these are two games that released, and one of them, Jumpix Jump, actually released on Steam, so they paid to put it on Steam. And they've clearly used just some prefab assets from Unity, which is fine. You can totally do that. But because the bunny is such a different model than the platforms, which is such a different model than sort of like the stretched world, the whole thing feels super jarring. And it's the same with Bounce. It's a game where you can't really tell what's in the foreground and what's in the background and what's where. So I jumped over that little mountain at the start because you have to, because it's actually a platform that you sort of ride up. But then this is also a platform, even though it's a completely different graphic style and it's more 3D. And that sort of differences in graphics makes it a confusing experience for the player. So even if you're using pre-made assets, they need to be consistent throughout in style. Doodle Escape is another game that was quite popular, but one of the major things with it is this is the same game. It's level 1 and 2 of the exact same game. And in level 1, it's almost like a completely different world than level 2. It almost looks like a completely different game. And that's really confusing to suddenly push players into like a different world almost. And it is a game about sort of drawing and doodles. But going from this world that's sort of pen and paper to this world that's kind of painted, and instead of moving from left to right on the screen, you can move from back to front with nothing to explain that that's what's happening to the player. It causes a lot of confusion, even if it's a good idea. So having something in between these two levels that better explain the experience would make more sense and would make for a better user experience when playing the game. Adios Amigos is another game where the two images don't look like the same game. So you spend some of the game flying around these little planets as this little ship. And then when you get there, it's like this beautiful hand-drawn world with all of these different aliens. And if the game had that same sort of hand-drawn aesthetic to the ship that you're flying, which is meant to be this ship here, and to the world around it, it would just make a more seamless experience. So then it's audio, what people listen to. You want to make sure the audio feels good for the game, and you want to make sure it loops correctly. There was a game that I played a long time ago. It was like a goat-based game. It came out when Goat Simulator came out as one of the like popular other goat games at that time. And I once put the game on, listened to some of the audio, went to get a coffee, came back, and the audio didn't loop anymore, and it was just silent. And that was really weird for me. I thought maybe my computer wasn't working, so I refreshed the whole thing. No, they just assumed that no one would sit on the home screen for that long, so they didn't loop the audio. So making sure that your audio is looped correctly, it's seamlessly looped, making sure that at intense moments your audio is more intense, that again makes for a better experience. It'll be a better time for the player who does get into your game. Again, when you have tutorials, they're not required if you have a how-to. You don't want to have tutorials that are just walls of text. No one's going to be able to digest a wall of text and then implement it in the game. And people are not going to be engaged with a wall of text. They will just skip over it. So if you have a tutorial in your game where someone's not optionally clicking on how to read it, you want to make sure that it's as use that item as possible. Like, this is something we're teaching you. Now you use it. Now we move on to the next thing. You want to make sure it's skippable as well, just in case people want to skip. If they can't skip your tutorial and they want to, that's a very frustrating start to the game. So this is a really good like start to a game that is a tutorial. It's a little bit on the longer side, so I'm going to move it forward at some points, but it gives you these visual clues into how to use it, which means that they don't have to have any language or any localization of different things, and a visual cue is something that even kids can understand. And then you start playing this level, and you take on loads and loads and loads of different like robots as they come forward, and you can move around, and another person could join you because it's a multiplayer game. It's like a local multiplayer. And then as you get more people coming to you, you start to see like different types of enemies, different types of bosses, and then more of these like ways to play. And they do make sure that you actually successfully play before it will trigger moving on. So it's not just one time you do the action, it's a few times to get that repetition in. So you're really learning the basics of how to fight and how to do the intense moments of the game. But as you continue, everything gets really, really like overwhelming. There's little aspects of story here, but soon it becomes very clear that you're not going to be able to make it through this level on your own, and that bad things are happening. And at this point, it actually moves you to the platform game, which isn't this intense to start out with. And you start earlier that day. You start with your day of platforming and just getting to know the game itself. So it's not super intense throughout. And this is a really engaging way to give people the meat of your game before actually making them play that aspect. Cuphead was known to have a hard tutorial and was known by lots of journalists that sucked in it. But Cuphead has a bad tutorial. Ducking down, it doesn't force you to continue that, to like learn that before you continue. So you can skip through all of this without actually doing a lot of it. The same with shooting. And there are many times where it just doesn't make sense to show a player all of this. So though Cuphead is a run and gun sort of shooter game, and though I'm doing terribly at this tutorial, a lot of the stuff that I learned, like parrying, you don't need for ages in the game. You don't need it until way later. So by the time it became a point where people needed to know how to parry, they're not likely to remember how to parry. And so they're just going to be frustrated. There's not going to be a whole lot of enjoyment there as they try to remember this thing that you showed them at the very start of the game ages ago. And that's something to watch out for. And creating a game that has a mechanic that then's only used for a small amount of time as well is another way that causes frustration. If I spend time trying to learn and master parry, and then it's not used much, or it's only used for like one level that I could have just skipped anyway, it almost seems like there's not a whole lot of point there for me as a player, and it can cause a lot of frustration. I'm seeing that more and more in multiplayer games, especially local co-op multiplayer games, having to learn a singular tool to then never use it ever again. So when it comes to your controls and level design, obviously that's something that you need to make sure that you keep in mind. You want to make sure your game isn't overly challenging at the start. There's a lot of games that as a developer, you will play it over and over and over again, especially puzzle games, especially like platformers. Like there are lots of games that you'll play over and over again. And you might look at it and go, yes, this level's too easy at the start. But play test it with other people. I've played so many games where the first jump for me has been so hard for me to achieve that I then don't want to play the game. I've tried and I'm frustrated, and it's not a rage platformer, so it shouldn't be this hard. Or the first level just feels so challenging when I don't understand completely what's going on. So having playtesters come in and just your friends, anyone with new set of eyes, play the first level, watch them, because that's really important. You want to make sure that you have controls set for different keyboards or have custom mapping. Don't ever make your game controller only. That's really hard for players. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for people who don't have controllers. Ensure that you have a clear path through your game so that people know where to go and they're not lost. And if you have a multiplayer game, it's a good idea to have bots. So this is a game called Dagion. I'm going to speed through this a little bit. You kind of shoot around and you collect animals, not collect animals, you collect these little gems and you beat up these little octopus looking animal things. And there is no tutorial. There's no how to. This is all you know to do. And when you die, you kind of jump around. So there's nothing here to tell me what I'm meant to do in the game. And it looks fairly open world. But when you actually find out what the game is, it's to get to these different points on the map. That's the point of the game. But nowhere in the game does it explain that. And you start up here. So there's no way for you to find these paths to even find the first thing that you're trying to collect. And because nothing tells the player to do that, they just assume it's not there. Cavern of Flight is a similar type game where it's a platformer. And right before this level, it taught me that I could climb down on the grass. So here, instead of jumping, because I don't like jumping, I've climbed down on the grass, saw there's a ladder, and thought I'm going the right way. I didn't want to jump. It told me to climb down on grass. I'm climbing down on grass. That's what I'm doing. But now where I'm at is the end of the game. So the game loops around and spits out here. And I'm here now confused. And I had to message the developer and ask what was going on. But it turns out I'm just at the end of the game. So making sure that you have a clear path forward that people can't then bypass to get to the wrong area and get stuck is another thing to look out for, especially when designing your game. If you do want to take some extra steps, you can try to get your game to be featured. You can do this by contacting Itch, contacting Game Jolt, making sure that your tags are good in the category that your games are in, making sure you filled out the tags correctly, going out and demoing your game at places. There are loads of digital events now since COVID where you can, like I am just at this flat today doing a talk, you can demo your game to journalists, to publishers. You can do a big indie pitch. There are so many different resources for that now, which is really quite amazing. Before you had to go to lots of physical events, which is demanding and quite hard for people to get around the world. If you're looking to contact game journalists, do email more than once. Do email a little bit about your game, include relevant links, and include what makes your game unique. Lead with that. If you have a platformer, don't lead with, I have a platformer. Lead with what your unique selling aspect is, the thing that makes your game stand out. And that's what journalists will pick up. That's what people will be interested in. And if you look for journalists who have played games similar to the games that you've played, and you've gone, hey, I saw that you reviewed this game, and my game is sort of like this game in these ways, so I think that you will like it. That's a good way to do it. I really like slice of life games, so often people will go, I see that you've reviewed Stardew Valley, and it's got farming and fishing. Moonglow Bay, our new game, has the sort of fishing game that you like, but it's different in the way that you are cooking with loads of your food, and those are mini games and stuff like that. It then makes your game sort of relatable. They get a picture in their head. But yeah, at the end of the day, you want to make something that you'd like. You want to make something that you think has impact. You want to make something that has a core gameplay that's fun. You want to do something that is exciting and that you want people to play further, something that makes an interesting game and something that you'd love. And other people will love that as long as you can put the love into it to make sure that it can be seen. And yeah, that's it. That's the end of my talk. Cool. I think I came in on time, but I only have one screen because I'm currently at a different conference, so I have no idea. So I'm going to turn my screen back.
Everything is fine. Yeah, probably please switch back to your presentation. Maybe we'll have some questions about it. Yeah. So, the question that I do have is like, I mean that I often hear a question like, what is why this game is different from other ones? And I feel like part of the things that you told in your talk are actually about being different. I mean that you talked about the game that's called Doodle Escape that has like two different visual style in the gameplay. So my question is like is it really bad? I mean, can we see in how it was selling and how it was taken by audience that decision interfered them to be successful?
So with that game, the biggest issue, like you can have a game that has two different styles that are meshed together, but with that game, it was such a big contrast between levels with nothing in between to explain to players it would be different, that a lot of players were like, I don't understand the second level. I don't understand why I'm not flat anymore. And there was lots of feedback like that. And the game actually changed and ended up having a lot more of the first level and then like a whole transition into how you'd play the second level and a little story as to why you're suddenly swimming and it's different. But without that, it does just confuse players. And if a player is watching a YouTube video, because that game got picked up by a lot of YouTubers who did specifically the second version of the world, or when people jumped into streams at the second version of the world, they thought it was a sequel of the game. And that was a comment that the game had a lot. It was like, are these pictures of like the sequel? Because we haven't gotten that far and it looks so different. So it's just hard to, I guess, almost convey that to an audience easily. And when stuff's hard to convey to an audience, it causes confusion. And when you make a game that's not purposefully like confusing and mysterious, it's important to have a clear direction.
Okay, I got it. Okay, maybe you can highlight somehow like maybe, I don't know, like top 3 mistakes that you usually, that you most often face with when you see like indie games pages.
Not having a trailer or any sort of gameplay video is a big mistake because people do click gameplay videos and trailers more often than you'd think. So not having that is a big issue. Not labeling builds properly. So people like on itch will put up 3 different builds and it'll just be like the game name 3 times instead of going like, this is for Windows, this is for Linux, this is for Mac. And I know that they have like the whatever file type they are, but as players, I guess we don't want to figure it out. We would just like very easy labeling. And then also just not renaming their file types is a big one. I've downloaded so many games, including games that were featured on itch that are just called Windows. That's not the name of the game. That's just you exported a window file, which is great. I'm so glad that it does tell me it's a window file, but you also need the game name on there because later on in life, if I'm looking for your game or if just right after I download, I don't go to my download folders for some reason and I'm looking for it, it's so hard to find your game in a pile of games called Window or Windows.
Okay, I got it. We have a question from Svetoslav, and he asked like that the first impression is of course important, but what if your first impression will be way better than the game itself? Could it do more harm than benefit?
Often, if you put that much into your first impression and you get people into your game, they'll still like your game. I've only seen like big AAA companies really ever deliver a promise in their first impression that's not made through in their game. When it comes to indies, getting people to play your game is already so hard. And the community around indie games and the people that play indie games are quite forgiving. There is the chance that you can overpromise in your first impression, but I don't see it happen very often. Obviously, you do need to put work into your game and make sure that you're not like selling a fairy tale, that you're not showing something that's not true to your game or true to the feel of your game or doesn't make sense with your game. But I do feel like if you have a really good first impression that's that big, you must have a good game, you know?
Yeah, I know, but sometimes I see the situation because it's often about like budget. Like when you start development, you have it, and you can spend it to make it like more beautiful and so on. And closer to the end, you have like less and less money, and sometimes it's like very very noticeable when I play some games. Okay, then I think that's all the questions that we have for you. Thank you very much for your talk. It was
Thank you
like
for
quite
having
nice,
me.
and I saw a lot of games that I did not see before ever in my life. So also thank you for that. So yeah, and you're always welcome on the Games Gathering, like in future.
Cool. Thank you so much. Hopefully this was beneficial.
Thank you. Bye.